The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.
When you think of legislative politics in Missouri, bipartisanship isn't something that comes to mind immediately. But every session, Republicans and Democrats in the Missouri General Assembly do come together to tackle difficult issues. State Representatives Rudy, Veit, and Keri Ingle not only teamed up on legislation to provide oversight to unlicensed residential care facilities, but they got a plan to Governor Mike Parson's desk. Veit and Ingle join us on the latest episode of Politically Speaking to break down their bill and whether Republicans and Democrats working together can be a feature and not just a bug. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
We have to talk about things that matter to people.
I've tried to bring that same aggressive iconoclast style with me to the United States Senate.
I think my district is a model for the state.
We put Missourians first.
You just kind of have to find the common ground with people.
I believe that this district deserves someone who represents their values.
After I came back to St. Louis, I started thinking that I could have a bigger role on the change that I wanted to make.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. Joining me from Jefferson City, she is St. Louis Public Radio State House reporter
Sarah Kellogg.
Also joining us from Jefferson City, a newcomer to the show. He represents Missouri's 59th House District.
Yes, Rudy Veit.
Thank you very much for joining us. And we have a returning guest. I honestly, Representative, I'm forgetting the number, but I know that you represent a portion of Jackson County.
I do. It is House District 35. I'm Representative Keri Ingle.
Welcome back to the show. We are bringing both of these guests on because they were the handlers of groundbreaking legislation that put oversight on unlicensed residential facilities in the state. And Senator Bill White of Joplin handled the legislation in the Senate. How did both of you get involved in this issue?
So essentially what happened was I read an article early on a Sunday morning about a year ago, a little over a year ago, from the Kansas City Star. It was an investigative report regarding unlicensed residential youth facilities across the state, and one in particular where there were numerous allegations of child abuse and neglect. And what was really striking about it is that there had been prior findings from the Children's Division, our child welfare agency in the state, for child abuse and neglect against several of the then alleged perpetrators. And so we had already made, the state had already made findings against these two alleged perpetrators. And they continue to have unsupervised access to really vulnerable kids. And that was really striking to me because there's really no other business in the state that would be allowed to operate in that way, whether it be a daycare, a school, a hospital, any facility like that. Having findings made against you for child abuse and neglect would bar you from having access to those vulnerable people. And so that was really striking to me. I also was completely unaware that Missouri was one of the only states in the country that allowed unlicensed residential youth facilities to even exist without any level of oversight. And my background is in child welfare. I've worked for the Children's Division. And so I know the policies surrounding that, and it just kind of flies in the face of common sense and best practice for working with kids and working with vulnerable individuals. And so it was really, really shocking. So I reached out to Representative Sheila Solon, who was the chair of Children and Families Committee, which I sat on. And she was appalled as well. And we were basically trying to figure out, was this one incident of bad actors taking advantage of loopholes in our code to take advantage of really vulnerable kids? Or was this a systemic issue? Was this something that we were going to see repeated in other facilities across the state? Well, one of the things that we figured out really quickly after having a hearing in, I believe it was November, we found out that the Department of Social Services in the state of Missouri had no way of tracking that where these residential facilities were, how many there were, who worked there, what children were there. There was absolutely no level of oversight. And oftentimes we would only find out about the existence of these facilities when something really horrendous would happen and when the media would bring it to the public's attention. So we immediately started looking for just really common sense solutions. This was bipartisan from the very beginning. I'm a firm believer that child abuse and child welfare should never be political issues. This should never be something that someone's trying to score political points with. These are the kids of the state of Missouri, and we have a duty to protect them. And so, and Representative Sheila Solon was instrumental in helping start that path toward this bill. We immediately thought of Representative Rudy Veit. I had worked with him a little bit in the legislature and had already built a little bit of a friendship and relationship with him. And I knew that he was a tenacious bulldog when it came to doing what was right, especially for the more vulnerable in our communities.
So, kind of why did both of you decide to team up on this legislation? What were the factors, Representative Veit, that made you kind of join the team?
Well, when they came to me with the problem, I realized something needed to be done. And it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about getting recognition. It was kind of my legal background. I just wanted to get the job done. And it would be foolish to try to get the job done without using all your resources. Keri had the background. She had the experience. She had worked and had a lot of contacts. And to try to put a bill through and not use those talents and exposures would have just been, if we, a legal standpoint, would be malpractice. You take whatever is out there you can use and realize what the goal is. And the goal in this case was certainly not about politics or grandstanding. It was trying to change the system, but also protect the religious part of the program, at the same time offer a very more safe environment for these children. I believe that these programs, these residential care facilities that are religiously operated, serve a very useful purpose. But when you have a few bad apples in there, which you're going to have if you have no regulations, you're going to destroy it not only for everybody, but the children that are going to be irreparably harmed. So, asking Keri or having Keri work with me and doing this jointly was just a common sense approach. It had nothing to do with politics.
So can you walk us through what the bill actually does?
Well, there's several parts in the bill. I'll let Keri, but several parts of the bill is, one is they have to be notification. They have to notify social services that they're here. That's the first step. Then there are certain requirements they have to do. They have to do background checks. We're only going to be asking them to do things that good homes would do anyway. Provide keep medical records, do health and safety inspections. We could go into court and get action taken to investigate, and also a method to actually stop them from existing in that organization existing. When you have a system where only Missouri and one other state allowed unlicensed, uncontrolled environments, we quickly became the ground where everybody who had devious ideas and that would migrate to. So that was one of the important parts of it. And the other part of it was that we did put provisions in there to protect the religious curriculum, because I believe, and most people agree, that they serve a very useful purpose if properly carried out. And we also know the influence of religious organizations in that here in our capital. And so that was an attempt to make it clear to them that we were not after them and we were working with them, And you will notice the bill went through. We had the support of the Southern Baptist Conference and Catholic Church and other religious organizations. They recognized that this was a serious problem, something needed to be done before it became much worse. And Keri, you can explain some of the, if you would, the things that the social services has to do also.
Sure. So social services provides a huge role. They're the investigative body for any allegations of child abuse and neglect across the state. And they also are the licensing body for all of the licensed facilities across the state. And so it's really important that they are aware of where these facilities are, that they have access to health records, records of the children's existence, that if there is an issue, that they are able to co-investigate with law enforcement and contact the prosecuting agency if they need to go further with that criminal investigation. There's oftentimes that, there were allegations at some of these facilities across the state, and it wasn't just one. As I mentioned earlier, that we did discover that this was a systemic issue, that this wasn't one rogue agency that was having these issues. It was several, and it was across the state. That when there are allegations of child abuse and neglect, that the Children's Division is able to, first of all, access these kids in order to work with law enforcement to determine, first of all, their safety, to ensure that these kids are safe. Second of all, to determine if there has been an illegal act against them, that they're able to prosecute or further ensure their safety. So remove them from that situation, or make sure that that alleged perpetrator no longer has access to them. And so one of the most important parts of the bill was ensuring that the Children's Division does have access to the alleged victims and witnesses at the facilities. What we were hearing in a lot of the committee hearings was that when there were allegations against in a particular facility, and the facility got wind that there was going to be an investigation, sometimes those children would be removed and moved to another facility, or moved out of state, or the Children's Division was not given access to them. They were denied access. And so one of the most important parts of the bill allows the Children's Division to conduct their investigation with law enforcement. It also gives law enforcement those tools. Going back to some of the things that Rudy was saying earlier, I think one of the most important parts of the bill, and really the most obvious and common sense part, is mandating background checks. These are individuals that are going to have unsupervised, unsupervised access to these very vulnerable kids. Oftentimes, the kids that are placed in these facilities have had behavioral issues, sometimes severe behavioral issues. Sometimes they've had substance abuse issues or untreated mental health. And so this is often a last resort for parents and caregivers. And so these are really vulnerable kids. These are kids that need treatment. These are kids that oftentimes, need additional support. And so we need to make sure that the people that are working with them and that are treating them are not going to further traumatize these kids. Oftentimes these kids have been exposed to a lot of trauma, which is oftentimes why they have substance abuse issues or mental health issues that are unresolved. And so when it made absolutely no sense to any of us. None of us would allow our children to be in the care of someone who had been accused of or convicted of really heinous crimes against children or other individuals. And so it was really important that we ensure that these really vulnerable kids receive the same protections.
One of the other things that we encountered early on was we added that the Attorney General, the social services can actually go to the Attorney General, because sometimes in small counties, these are very influential employers. The security staff may also be deputy sheriffs, and things kind of just get overlooked. So if push comes to shove, social services can go to the Attorney General's office and make sure that there is some law enforcement pushing this. The other thing that was important in the bill, one of the things that I didn't realize is that important until I'm getting calls on it now, is that well, I did know it was important, but I just didn't think it was that prevalent, is that they would have in their contracts would not allow the parents or guardian to have unfettered access to the children. They would always be the ones there and overseeing everything. Well, a child's not going to go forth and be truthful and testify about what's happening to him when he knows they're sitting there listening. And that was one of the things we had to clear up with. So in law enforcement, they can talk to the children individually and not with the people from the residential care facility sitting right next door. It's all been an effort to try to bring this out to the open, and most of it is just common sense approaches. When you have an organization that there's no rules except the ones they make, and you have parents who are at wit's ends willing to try anything because they're having challenges with their children, and they'll agree to anything, thinking they're a good non-for-profit organization, and they were a lot of people, or some of them were just not that, and they were hiding behind this statute.
And so how do these new requirements, these new expectations, these new things that these homes have to do, how does this law kind of compare to other states? What are other states doing that what did you kind of look at? How did it influence your decision making as well?
As anything, when you look at a bill, you have to look at all the parties involved, look for the unintended consequences, and to get as many people on board as you can. And certainly you had some, these facilities with religious background were afraid that once we let the state in, they would control the curriculum. They would take away their individual methods of way they teach and teaching the Christian principles that they were wanting to instill in these individuals. So we had to get a method that protected both. And so the notification deal is basically, they have to notify us they're in existence. There's a certain amount of information they get. That gives the basis for social services to be aware of them. And then this bill will set out procedures that if they get reasonable cause to believe abuse, neglect, they can go in and get a subpoena and go in and talk to them. They can talk to the other children. They can do a more normal investigation like they could in any situation. Other states, some states that went to peer licensing. There were some who would like
and that's actually most states.
Mostly. And there are a lot of people, or there are some people here wanted it to be that method. But getting that bill through our legislature probably wasn't going to happen. We had the power here that one senator or two senators can pretty well stop a bill if they want to. And so we had to work with everybody, and this was not a compromise. I think it will serve the purpose. And as any time in legislation, we want the government's role to be at least intrusive as possible and still get the job done. And I think it will get the job done. If it doesn't, unfortunately, some children will be harmed, and we'll have to go back to peer licensing. Like I said, there are people who would like to have licensing. It would have made it cleaner. But at the same token, you got to look at where you're at and be realistic. And I don't believe licensing would have passed.
These issues were discussed as early as the early 2000s. So this is not necessarily a new issue within the legislature, and attempts to address the issues were quickly squashed in the early 2000s when these concerns were brought to the legislature, and for the reasons that Rudy suggested, which was that there are a lot of parties in the state of Missouri that view religious freedom as the absolute most important thing, and that any infringement by the government is just unacceptable. It is important to note that there are religious facilities across the state that are licensed by the state. And so they're not mutually exclusive concepts. And like Rudy said, there are many states across the country who only allow licensed facilities because of the abuses that they have seen. Until this law was signed, Missouri was one of just a very, very few states in the entire country that allowed unlicensed facilities to exist.
Why was that?
I think it was because of the view of the importance of religious liberty in this state, and the belief that the government doesn't have any role in infringing upon that religious liberty. And my argument to that is very simple. When you use religious liberty to harm children, we can't allow that. We just absolutely cannot allow that in our society. to, and you're not really using religious liberty, you're abusing it. You're using the name of God and all of that to really manipulate and to harm people. And we absolutely can't allow that. And there shouldn't be any entity in the state where there is a loophole that allows abuse. Abuse is abuse regardless where it occurs. And we need to have equal application of the law.
And that's why you'll see a lot of religious organizations actually back this bill, because it's kind of a preemptive strike. If the abuse kept going, we probably would have been licensed. But they realized that these organizations or facilities that were abusing the children were destroying the reputation and the viability of all of the other religious organizations. Any organization or residential care that was doing things right would follow most of our requirements anyway. So that's why you saw that a lot of religious organizations did get on board, is because they realized what these individuals were doing had nothing to do with religion. It was for profit and their own impure interest. And so that was the part of the bill that helped, is getting the various religious organizations on board also to emphasize the point. This is not an attack on religion. It was not an attack on the curriculum. It was an attack on those people that are just abusing children in the name of religion.
And you touched on this a little bit, but so what were some of the challenges that you both faced in getting this bill passed, and who were some of the main opponents?
So I think that a lot of the opposition is simply a misunderstanding of the intent of the bill and the problem at hand. And so there's a lot of misconceptions around the kids, the victims and survivors at these facilities. There's a lot of labels put on them, that they're bad kids, that they can't be trusted, that they're liars. And as a social worker, I'll be the first to tell you that when you label a child as bad or troubled, it makes them more vulnerable to abuse, because people are not going to trust them. You've already decided that this child is a liar, and it puts them at further risk of abuse. And it's really easy for someone in an abusive situation to tell them, as part of the abuse, I can do whatever I want to you. No one's going to believe you. You're a bad kid. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why we face so much opposition, is that there is a belief that these kids are bad, and that these the alleged perpetrators are simply, good-natured and well-intended individuals that are just trying to help these kids that are in a bad situation.
Do you think, before you answer, do you think that if that opposition wasn't in place, you may have been able to actually get like different legislation, more, and something like licensing in place?
Well, I don't know. We look at opposition. There was some, but that was because I think a lot of people were just not fully informed. As you know, it passed the House without, I don't think there's one no vote. It passed the Senate committee without any no votes. Again, on the Senate floor, we had a few. But what really the motivating and the most important factor in this case was not what I did or Keri did, is these kids came from all over the United States and flew in here and told their personal stories. And once anyone heard those personal stories, they knew it was time to do something. And I mean, they came in here from 5 or 6, 7 states and one of them, they did it at their own personal expense. And then they came back for the Senate hearings. And once these were heard in these committees, you had the support. So mainly it was, they were the motivating factor of what got this bill through. Without them and their personal stories, I don't think our arguments would have had near the credibility and the urgency of the problem. When you heard their stories, you couldn't believe that this could happen and then not be someone going to jail. So
I completely agree with that. I mean, the survivors were so instrumental from the very beginning, in talking with the Kansas City Star and the other investigative journalists, to pushing for reforms, to coming and testifying. And we had a mom who testified at the first committee hearing, who drove all night from Texas in a snowstorm to get to our hearing. And so the dedication that the survivors and their families have shown should be commended. Whenever a survivor tells their story, it encourages others to come forward and tell theirs. And so I think that was so instrumental. And I completely agree with Rudy that without them, that none of this would have happened. But to your question, Jason, regarding, do I think that if people had believed the survivors, would we have faced as much opposition, or would we have been able to push for more legislation or stronger legislation? Yeah, I do. But I think that a lot of that has to do with, the culture of the state, the culture of the legislature, and balancing principles regarding religious freedom and protection of children, which ultimately I think we did really well and really beautifully in this bill. But I think that pendulum swung a little bit further in one direction, which is why it wasn't, we wouldn't be able to push for legislation that required licensure.
So now that the bill has been signed into law, what happens next?
The Department of Social Services is promulgating rules for their department to handle regarding receiving notification of the background checks, receiving notification of the facility's existence is the first step, and notifying everyone in the state that this is all the facilities, that this is the law. And so there have been public meetings with feedback from stakeholders and the public regarding what the rules should encompass.
There are some organizations or care facilities that haven't fully, or maybe they're just waiting on the regulations, but still not letting the parents have unfettered access to their children and that. And so, once you get the momentum going, I think that other people, other survivors will be willing to step forward, and children will be more willing to step forward, and parents who place their children there, who had faith in these places, now question it. And so there's going to be a lot more parental supervision, I think, going into play too, because they realize and have seen just how horrible it could be. And just because your children are there doesn't mean you're a bad parent or guardian. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. And so I think that's going to make it the most important is the parents that are placing their children there are not going to just blindly put faith in them because they're a religious organization.
We'll be right back after this quick break with State Representatives Rudy Veit and Keri Ingle.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
And we're back on Politically Speaking with State Representatives Rudy Veit and Keri Ingle. Representative Veit is a Republican from Cole County, and Representative Ingle is a Democrat from the Lee Summit area. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about in the last few minutes we have on this show. Like, this is one of the main examples of how bipartisan legislation was able to get through the General Assembly, which you talked about earlier in the show about how that came together. But, when you look at state legislative politics, maybe as a passive observer, or if you read the headlines of a contentious bill or issue, it comes off, the state legislature comes off as a very fractious and partisan place. Is it something like this, like a one-off, or do relationships like this between Republicans and Democrats happen all the time to tackle really difficult issues like you just laid out in the first part of the show?
Politics do play a role up here, and it serves kind of a useful purpose. Though you have two different politics, and that's like the judicial system itself. It's an adversary role. This isn't a judiciary system, but how do you get to the right answer? It usually takes some input from both sides. But I do strongly believe, we have to have a lot more teamwork on issues that are not political. There are so many things up here that are not political, and we need to join up and work together on, and at least talk to each other about, because usually the middle ground probably is the better road to be on. That's not a very popular position here, but sometimes, like this bill, there was people who could have made a total political issue out of it, and it would have, it would have hung up the bill and it would have not passed. I generally would hope that everybody up here is making their decisions what is best for the state and not for themselves or a political party. But certainly politics is a part of it here, and that is one of the factors we also had to consider in how we put our bill forward.
That was one of the reasons why I've so treasured my relationships with both Representative Sheila Solon and Rudy, is that they are willing to put the best interest of Missourians ahead of politics and ahead of their own careers. And that's something that I wish we would see more of in politics. I know that Rudy's kind of downplaying it a little bit, but it's so valuable to have colleagues like him that really put their principles before politics. As I've said again, and I'll continue to say, there's no room for politics in child welfare. There's just not. We should always be asking, if the best interest of the child isn't at the forefront of what you're doing, then you need to stop. I think that there are a lot of principled representatives and senators in Jefferson City who were willing to come together and make this happen, that were willing to come together and, despite opposition and despite history of opposition, were willing to do what was right. And so I think that that's the most important thing. And obviously, as a member of the minority party, I wish that we could do this far more often. But I also live in reality that we are in, if not the most polarized political climate that I've ever seen. I think that we are right now. But I believe that this is an example of how we can work together, and how we should on so many more issues that shouldn't have politics at the front of what we're doing, that should have the best interest of Missourians. And a lot of times we agree on the end results. We just disagree how to get there. And so I think that if we find ways to work together, that we can move mountains.
One of the other things I noticed, and I mentioned this in the kind of overview of the legislative session, is House Democrats got quite a bit done this year. And I would say that probably one of the most difficult things about being in the legislature is being in the House as a Democrat, just because you don't have the filibuster power. How do you explain that? What were some of the factors that allowed you to be successful this past session?
Well, I think that my colleagues have a slew, just a plethora of really amazing policy ideas, and that they are experts at persuading others to work on these ideas with them. And so I think that that's the first piece. I think that when you have a supermajority, and this is my observation from the other side of the aisle, I think when you have a supermajority, oftentimes there's more division in those ranks than there can be across the aisle. And so sometimes when others are busy scuffling over different, whether something is conservative enough, the other side of the aisle can kind of be like, well, I had this really great idea. What do you think about helping me with this? Whether it's, mental health parity, or having WIC and SNAP be used at farmers markets, things that are really beneficial to communities across the state. And so I think that the reason why a lot of these bills were successful was because you have really pragmatic Democrats working across the state for communities sometimes that they're not even a part of. But we were able to partner with really logical, really pragmatic Republicans across the aisle to get across. And I think some of that was that when you have a supermajority, and I wasn't a member of the legislature when the Democrats were in a majority, obviously, but I think that you can probably see that down the line, that when a party has such a large accumulation of power, sometimes a lot of the conflict is within that party not across the aisle.
Well, as any party, we have some division, but I assume we have no more division than what the Democrats do. They just don't have the numbers. And you know, there are a lot of representatives that are here that are open-minded and want to get the right thing done, and they're not playing politics on every issue. There are some issues that we have as Republicans, we stand for conservative principles that there is no bending on. Certainly there are issues like abortion that we're going to disagree on. Most bills need by far the majority of our party in support of it to get a bill through. So while that we don't agree on everything, and no group does everybody agree with. If I can get somebody to agree with me 75% of the time, I'd feel fortunate. So it's people with different ideas and different backgrounds is what make for good legislation.
And so on these more partisan issues like gun control, abortion, COVID-19 policy, how are these types of relationships where you have worked together before help when dealing with those issues? Or are those tensions going to exist even if bipartisan relationships didn't exist?
Well, if nothing else, it keeps everything a little more civil on the floor, and they let, you know, people can disagree and they will disagree, but you can do it civilly. And I mean, there are a lot of policies I don't not oppose as long as you have a rational basis for your opinions. I don't find it offensive if somebody disagrees with me. It is when someone has an opinion that is based purely on what is politically good for them is what causes me concerns.
I think you're right, Rudy. That it's easier to respect people's positions when you know that they are strongly held beliefs that are consistent with their values. When you see people making, politically grandstanding in order to further their career, as opposed to doing what is principled and right, or is best for the Missourians that they represent, it's a lot harder to swallow.
Well, representatives, thank you so much for joining us on this really important and fascinating discussion. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is a part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. You can find me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. How can people follow you on Twitter, Sarah?
You can follow me at Sarah K. Kellogg with 2 G's.
How could people follow you on Twitter or any other parts of the World Wide Web, Representative Ingle?
I am at Rep. Keri Ingle on Twitter.
And Representative Veit, I'm not sure if you're on Twitter, but is there any way for people to get a hold of you either through social media or otherwise?
Well, they can certainly always get me through the House site is rudy.veit, V-E-I-T, at house.mo.gov. And I am on Twitter, but I just don't Twitter.
I think
I do see some of the comments.
Oh. Anytime I hear a legislator say they're not on Twitter, I'm like, that legislator is smart and is going to go places. And I say that as somebody who has tweeted 100,000 times. And then on that note, until next time, so long.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.